Uh, this happened at the first service too. It was my turn to come up, and then all the music people left. My name is Richard Randolph, and I am the Director of Stewardship for the for the Nebraska United Methodist Foundation. And I am very honored and privileged to be here. I want to thank Kirsty for inviting me to come here and to preach here at First United Methodist Church, and also for the opportunity to make a presentation after this service at a luncheon about the Nebraska United Methodist Church and how we feel that we can help this congregation. Our goal, our motto is to be partners with you in your ministry. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and talk a little bit about the finances of ministry. But first, a little bit about me. I've been ordained in the United Methodist Church for over 40 years now. And the reason I know it's over 40 years is that my second year in ministry, I married my wife, and we celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary in November. So it's been 40 years, and we celebrated the anniversary, I guess, the only way we could do. I actually preached that Sunday in Omaha, and she went with me, but then I had to take her out to lunch. So I've served churches in Maryland, Kansas, and Nebraska. And for 8 years, I was a senior pastor here in Lincoln at Christ United Methodist Church, which is, down 48th Street to 48th and NA, approximately there. I have a confession I want to make to this congregation. Back in 2011, 2012, when the Nebraska and Kansas conferences merged, I was the pastor at Meriden United Methodist Church in Meriden, Kansas. And I was thinking, now I could be appointed to Nebraska. And what would that look like? And so one afternoon when I should have been working on my sermon for the next day, I just started Googling United Methodist churches in Nebraska. And I came up on First United Methodist Church in Lincoln, and I just fell in love with this sanctuary based upon the pictures that were on Google. I was just in awe. It was so beautiful, and I was just overwhelmed by the beauty of this historic space. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if I got to preach sometime at Lincoln First United Methodist Church? And then several years later, Bill Ritter, who was the superintendent here in Lincoln, called me, and they said, Richard, we have a suggested appointment for you in Lincoln. And I was like, what I saw in my mind was this sanctuary. But what Bill was saying on the phone was Christ United Methodist Church on A Street. So if you know people at Christ, don't tell them I saw all of this. But finally today, I get to preach in this historic sanctuary. Since July, I've been appointed to an extension ministry with the Nebraska Foundation. And as I said, the Nebraska United Methodist Foundation, our motto is, "Your partners in ministry." And we strive to support the ministry of all Nebraska United Methodist churches in three ways. The first way is we provide investment services for churches with endowments. And we currently are entrusted with approximately $50 million from Nebraska United Methodist churches. The second way that we support churches is through scholarships and ministry grants. And we provide scholarships in the form primarily for persons preparing for ministry. So persons who are going to seminary or going through the course of study program, we try to support all of the requests that we get from that. In terms of ministry grants, we have a number of different programs, and I'll talk in more detail later about those. But one is a ministry grant program. Excuse me, last fall we gave $90,000 to different churches. I think it was 22 churches in Nebraska for different ministry programs that they wanted to start or continue. And you need to know, I've been encouraging your pastor to make an application this spring for a ministry grant for the work that you're doing with the Matt Talbot Center. So, I'm sorry? Malone Center. My bad. Matt Talbot's a good ministry too. But it is the Malone Center, and I'm excited about that and hope that she'll finalize that grant. The third way in which we try to support churches is through providing resources and consulting services. So we provide online worship and stewardship resources for clergy, both here in Nebraska. I suppose anybody can access those. We will come to churches to provide programs and training like I'm doing today. And I will come and provide pulpit support like I am today. We also help set up legacy societies, which we at the Nebraska United Methodist Foundation believe are so vitally important for United Methodist churches to set up and maintain today. It is so important that every United Methodist congregation have a legacy society which they've set up. And I'd love to tell you why we think it's so critical. And I intend to do that in the presentation after the worship service. If you'll come. Excuse me. Today I want to talk about the story of the wise men, the three wise men, or magi. We think three because they brought three gifts to the Christ child. They came to see the baby Jesus. It's a familiar story to us, right? You had already heard that passage from the Bible probably many times before it was read today. It's part of the Christmas story. If you have a Christmas pageant, usually there's some wise men who come as a part of that pageant. I remember as a kid getting to be a wise man, and so I got to dress up in my bathrobe, and they put a little crown on my head, and I got to be a wise man in that way. We celebrate Epiphany Sunday today because we think that was when the wise men actually came to provide their gifts and their homage to the Christ child. So it's easy to take this story for granted. We hear it all the time. We're familiar with it all the time. When it's read, I mean, maybe our minds just sort of like, yeah, we've heard this before. But today I'd like for us to look at this story from a fresh perspective. I'd like for us to think of this story as a clash between two different cultures, two different paths. On the one hand, we have the culture or the world of the wise men. Wise men can be translated from Greek also as astrologers or sorcerers or magicians. Although Matthew doesn't say exactly where the wise men came from, biblical scholars have figured out that it must have been from either Persia, which is now contemporary Iran, or Babylon, which is now contemporary Iraq. So they came from that part of the world. And we know that the wise men were basically pagan priests. They would have been experts in astrology and dream interpretation, and they would have been the spiritual leaders of their culture. whether it was Babylon or Persia. Based upon their gifts to the baby Jesus, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, we have inferred that they were also very wealthy men, very wealthy. And finally, they were probably viewed in their culture as the scientists of today. They were constantly studying the stars and charting the movement of the stars in the night sky. Now, on the other hand, we have the world and the culture of King Herod and what I'm going to call the Jewish establishment in Jerusalem. Religiously, King Herod was a practicing Jew. His family converted to Judaism before he was born, and so he grew up in the Jewish faith, and he was a practicing Jew. And although we refer to him as King Herod, the reality is that he was more of a client king to the Roman Empire than he was a true king. He got the title king because it was conferred upon him by the Roman Senate. And at this point in Israel, it's important to keep in mind that Israel, or Judea, has been conquered and occupied by the Roman imperial army. At this point in its history, Israel is a captured state, and so Herod was appointed as the king to keep order and stability in that kingdom. Herod was a stooge, basically, of the Roman imperial army, helping them to continue the subjugation and the occupation of Judea. Now, based upon historical non-Jewish records of King Herod and the events that transpired, biblical scholars believe that Herod was most likely insane. Insane. He was an insane tyrant. He was mentally very, very unstable, and he was clearly very paranoid. The other establishment officials were the high priest at the temple, as well as the scholars and the lawyers who were experts in the Jewish law. Like the wise men from the east, King Herod and the officials in Jerusalem were highly educated and very wealthy. And working within the parameters of the Roman Empire, King Herod and the other Jerusalem officials were fairly powerful. And it's important for us to note how both of these two worlds responded to the good news of the birth of Christ. On the one hand, as they studied the stars, the wise men observed this new star in the night sky, and they interpreted it as announcing the birth of a new king for the country of Judea. And so when they come to this conclusion, they hop on their camels and they begin traveling as fast as they can on a camel towards Judea. We normally think in the Christmas story that the wise men are following this star that's bright and is just leading them towards Judea. But I think it's more likely that they saw the star and they interpreted it as a star of the king of Judea. But I don't think the star moved. First of all, from a scientific perspective, that just doesn't happen. But also when you think about it, if they were actually following the star literally, then why did they need to stop in Jerusalem and ask King Herod for directions? They would have gone straight to Bethlehem. But what they did was what you would normally do. You would go to the leader of the country and say, hey, we've seen this star, and from our interpretations, it must mean that you have a new leader who's just been born, and we're here to pay him honor. And that's what they did, right? That's what they said to King Herod. The wise men were seekers and doers of the word. They believed that God was still active in the world, and they were looking forward expectantly for God to transform the world. They were pagans, but they were doers and seekers after God. Now, on the other hand, King Herod and the other officials in Jerusalem, they had a completely different reaction to the announcement of the birth of the Messiah. Matthew says they were greatly troubled. Greatly troubled. Now, why would they be greatly troubled? It's because they were enjoying the status quo. They were enjoying the status quo. Even though it meant they were subjugated to the Roman Empire, they were enjoying their position in life. They were enjoying the status quo, and they didn't want anything to change. Now, let me repeat that. King Herod and the Jewish establishment were opposed to any change. Opposed to change. And just think about it. As soon as they were told where they could find the newborn Messiah, the wise men hopped back on those camels and headed off to Bethlehem as fast as the camels would go. Yet King Herod and the rest of the official Jerusalem, they stayed in Jerusalem. They stayed in Jerusalem. And don't you think that's odd? Here we have the Hebrew people who have been looking forward to the birth of the promised Messiah for 1,000 years. And yet when they heard that the Messiah had been born, they didn't even bother to go see him. We know that the Gospel of Matthew was written for a community of Jews who had become Christians. And one of the central themes throughout Matthew's Gospel is the hypocrisy of the Jewish religious leaders at the time of Jesus. By hypocrisy, Matthew means devout persons who say but who do not do. Or in the modern vernacular, they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk, right? Unlike the wise men, the Jewish leaders were not really seekers and doers after the word. They liked the status quo. They didn't want to change. Of course, now we live more than 2,000 years after this happened, and yet I think in religion, in the faith, in Christianity, there continues to be a clash between two cultures that still exist. We need to ask ourselves, are we seekers and doers like the wise men? Are we expectantly looking forward to how God is at work in the world and is busy transforming the world? Or are we more like King Herod and the official Jewish community? Are we basically comfortable with the status quo? Would we oppose change even if the change was brought on by God? Are we hypocrites? That is, do we say that we're Christians, but we fail to do what God calls upon us to do? Do we talk the talk, but not walk the walk? In other words, what I'm asking is what kind of church, what kind of faith community will First United Methodist Church be in 2024? Will you follow the way of the pagan wise men, being seekers and doers for God? Or will you be more like King Herod and his advisors, satisfied with the status quo and reluctant to make any changes? Now, it's easy to stand here in 2024 and say that, oh, we are more like the wise men. Of course. But we need to be careful here. Because to be a seeker and doer of the Word means that we must be serious about our faith and about our commitment to Christ. To be a seeker means that we are constantly reading and studying the Scriptures, seeking the divine anew in God's Scriptures. To be a seeker means that we cultivate a consistent spiritual and prayer life, seeking to grow closer to God through prayer and meditation. And to be a doer means that we are constantly looking for ways that we can serve God. Constantly asking the question, what is God calling on us to do next? It means that we are willing to try new avenues of service individually as disciples and collectively as the church. To be a doer means that we do not resist change, but rather we embrace change. Now, let me just pause here for a moment and say, this could have been two types of sermon. It could be a sermon that challenges, or it could be a sermon that celebrates. A sermon that challenges versus a sermon that celebrates. And what I want you to hear today is that I want it to be both. I want to celebrate this congregation, what you've done in the past. The beacon that First United Methodist Church has been to United Methodist and others living in Lincoln. I've watched you from afar. Well, not that far, just down on A Street. For 8 years, I've watched this congregation. I know that your past, your legacy is filled with being seekers and doers after God. I look at your bulletin and the upcoming events. I looked at that this morning. There are a lot of places where, as a congregation, you're doing. So I want to celebrate all that you've done, but I also want to challenge you to do more. I know that you have this new project that's beginning to evolve and come to fruition with the Malone Center. That's important. It's important to keep reaching out to your neighbors. The theme of this week, this month of neighbors and reaching out to your neighbors, and that's what it means to be a seeker and a doer. So I want to celebrate who you are and who you've been, but I want to challenge you to continue. I want you to go away from this service asking yourself this question: what type of church will First United Methodist Church be in 2024? What type of individual disciples will you and I be in 2024? Will we follow the way of the wise men and be seekers and doers? Or will we instead follow the way of King Herod and his entourage, be satisfied with the status quo and not want to change anything? Which will we do? Amen.